It was a snowy winter morning, and the girl was busy preparing food for the upcoming dinner. The smell of a juicy steak filled the kitchen as it sizzled on the griddle. She was just about to flip it when an angry woman suddenly burst in, slapping the skillet in frustration. "Why isn't the food ready yet?" she demanded. Without waiting for an answer, she tasted a piece of the meat, spitting it out immediately. "It's too salty," she shouted. The cook, calm and emotionless, looked at her without flinching. "You expect people to eat this? Especially today of all days," the woman continued, her voice rising with irritation. "Maybe I'll replace you with someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe a man." The girl sighed heavily, turning away. Then, with a strange smile, she replied, "Unfortunately, I can't call on my family's employees to do work outside their duties." The woman frowned, shocked by the girl's insolence, her eyes fixed on her. Meanwhile, another voice echoed through the house. A young girl stormed into the room, shouting loudly. "Where's the item I asked you to find?" she demanded. The cook, slightly surprised but unfazed, wiped her hands and handed over a package. But the young girl snatched it from her angrily, tearing it open only to find it wasn't what she had asked for. "What is this?" she shouted, her anger boiling over. The cook, still calm, sighed and looked at the ceiling. "I saw something like it on Instagram a few days ago," she said nonchalantly. "It's kind of popular." "I know." The young girl, now visibly frustrated, held onto the package tightly, refusing to let go. "Don't you dare touch it," she snapped. "Next time, get me what I asked for." As tension simmered, the woman ordered the cook to throw the package away and get some food delivered instead. The cook, on her way out, shouted back that it wasn't her problem, and the woman could handle it herself. After the shouting match, the girl returned to cooking, humming quietly to herself. But soon the woman reappeared, her tones sharp. "You're free this weekend. We're going to the hospital." The girl blinked in surprise. "Why? What's wrong, Mum?" The woman's face twisted with anger. "Why are you pretending? You know exactly what's wrong. It's been over a year since you got married and still no children." She spoke as if it were obvious. "It's your fault. You need to get smart and figure this out. If you can't, I'll do it for you." The girl stood silent, her breath caught in her chest. After a moment, she smiled slyly. "We've already discussed it with Saya. We'll go to the hospital together." Her mother's eyes widened, grinding her teeth in frustration. Clearly annoyed, she sighed deeply and changed the subject, bringing up the vacant position at the girl's company. Then Brandon knew he was being preyed. The girl smiled again and casually mentioned that her stepfather wanted to work there, but Sok had already taken care of it. Just then a man's voice chimed in, offering to help, but the woman quickly cut him off. If my daughter had been as loving as Ura, she wouldn't need help solving everything. She then turned to her daughter, asking, "What's so great about you anyway?" At that very moment, there was a knock on the door. The guests had arrived. The woman's demeanor instantly changed. She greeted them with a bright smile, welcoming them into her home. The guests marveled at the house, praising its beauty. "Has the house gone up by 200 million?" one asked. The woman laughed and said it wasn't that expensive yet, leading them inside as the girl served plates of food. The guests complimented her, calling her beautiful beyond words, and thanked her for the lovely meal. Soon, laughter and conversation filled the room as they enjoyed the feast. After the meal, the girl stepped out for a moment. Her mother called after her, asking her to bring more meat, but the girl was already heading somewhere. When her mother asked where she was going, the girl didn't respond, lost in her own thoughts. A moment later, the girl was gone. The woman, growing tense, started to follow her daughter, but stopped when she saw the girl glowing with joy as she re-entered the room. The guests fell silent, watching in awe. The girl approached her mother with a smile, taking her hand. "Thank you, Mum, for always being so kind to me," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm so lucky to have you." Her mother stood frozen, stunned by her words. Then, with another sweet smile, the girl added, "Sok just called. He wants me to meet him soon." With that, she left, leaving her mother speechless. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the girl sat in her car, the smile fading from her face. She remembered her mother's words, harsh and unfeeling. "Even if today is the day you were born, it's just another ordinary day." The girl hit the steering wheel in frustration, yelling, "This isn't right. It shouldn't be like this." Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Messages from her husband Suk had come in, asking how her day was going. She unlocked her phone to see 4 messages and a missed call from him. Ben began texting her husband. In the first message, he apologized for not being available earlier. The second message explained that he was still delayed in a meeting, but 3 hours later he would finally be free. A small smile crept across U's face at the thought of finally seeing her lover. She exhaled deeply, thinking about everything happening, then glanced back at her phone. 2 hours and 37 minutes had passed. Enduring time with her husband's family, she needed to be at the hotel soon. After responding to Sok, U set her phone down and started the car. As she drove, her thoughts drifted to memories of an evening with her husband. She had been telling Sok that she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. He simply replied, "I know." U continued, explaining that maybe she could sleep in the same room, but never in the same bed. Sok smiled, repeating that he understood. He then added, "You won't have a normal family life with me, will you?" Be confused by the question, U hesitated. Sok's smile widened as he said, "I don't care about anything as long as I have you." Her eyes had sparkled at his words, leaving her speechless. Suddenly, Ura snapped back to reality. She stood in a store, staring blankly at the floor. The cashier's voice startled her, asking if she had placed an order under Suk's name. She quickly confirmed, then left the store, realizing she was running late. Rushing down the street, she heard voices around the corner. As she approached, she realized one of them was Suk. What was he doing here? Then she saw Ura standing next to him. Yu immediately turned away, listening intently to their conversation. Sok was telling Ura that she was the only one he loved, that he didn't need Yu. At those words, U's world crumbled. She froze, barely processing what Sok was saying next, that he would file for divorce soon and be with Ura. U couldn't bear to hear any more. The box she had been carrying slipped from her hands, the cake inside tumbling to the ground. Sok and Ura turned sharply at the noise, and there stood Ura, her face blank and emotionless. Ura immediately rushed to her, calling out and begging her not to jump to conclusions, but Yu already knew. There was nothing left to save. She smiled bitterly, turning away from them. Ignoring their pleas, she began to walk quickly, wanting to escape them, their betrayal ringing in her ears. As Ura chased after her, Yu's steps quickened, her anger growing. Ura finally grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "Please, just listen," Ura begged, for what felt like the 100th time. Furious, Yu asked one simple question. "Did you know that Sok was in love with you?" Ura couldn't answer, her silence revealing the truth. Ura couldn't answer. Then why did you keep hanging around him? Guilt flooded Ura's face. She confessed that Seok was kind and understanding, and she had assumed her feelings were fleeting. Grabbing Yu's hand, she urged her to talk to Seok, that he could change his mind. Ura gritted her teeth, realizing how selfish Ura truly was. Sok chimed in, attempting to defend himself, but U shot him a venomous look. She ripped her hand free from Ura's grasp and walked away, no longer willing to listen to them. Her pace quickened until she was nearly running, lost in a blur of emotion. She couldn't hear or see anything around her, including the crosswalk timer ticking down. A speeding car bowed through the intersection, and by the time U noticed, it was too late. The car's headlights glared like demon eyes in the dark, and in an instant, Yu's body was airborne. Her heel remained on the ground, leaving a red trail behind. Ura screamed, horrified by the sight. Sok instinctively tried to shield her eyes, but the damage had already been done. Tears welled in Yu's eyes as she hung in the air, thinking of one thing. Why had she ever believed Sok could change? In her final moments, everything became painfully clear, but it was too late. Yu died on the very day she had wished she wouldn't. The story shifts back to the past, to an orphanage on a night when it was snowing heavily. Yu had been abandoned as an infant, left crying in front of the door. She had gone through many adoptions and rejections, but one night, a pair of hands lifted her from the darkness. She was adopted by a wealthy family, and for a time, things seemed to improve. But soon after, her adoptive mother, Jumin, passed away, leaving a deep void in Yu's life. What followed was even worse. Her adoptive father, Shanghai, brought home another girl, the same age as Yu. This girl was Ura, who was overjoyed at the thought of having a sister. U had been diligently practicing piano, playing in large concert halls, pouring all her energy into her performances. But no matter how hard she worked, she could never outshine Ura, who excelled effortlessly in everything she did. Yu watched from the sidelines, always overshadowed by her sister, even in their school years. While her parents praised Ura for her academic success, Ura stood trembling as she looked at her own grade sheet. From the moment Ura was born, she had been surrounded by misfortune, always overlooked. She remembered walking down the school corridor, minding her own business, only to open her locker and have a pile of ruined books and notebooks fall out. The students laughed at her, mocking her for being adopted. She knew exactly who had spread the rumors. Yu looked across the room and spotted Yakan, who was laughing with the others, her voice echoing in the corridor. The pain of betrayal hit hard. Her own sister, enjoying herself while Yu stood isolated. At home, Yu tried to reassure herself that things would eventually be okay. She could get through it. But just as she was finding some peace, a noise outside her door caught her attention. Startled, she stepped out of her room to investigate, but the hallway was empty. On the floor lay several boxes and a letter. Curious, she picked up the letter and opened one of the boxes. Inside was a record player. Confused but intrigued, Yu unfolded the note. It was from someone who had overheard her mentioning her love for old things. Embarrassed by the gesture, he explained that he had recorded some of his favorite old songs for her, hoping she would enjoy them. At the end of the letter, he wished her a happy birthday. The sentiment overwhelmed Yu. She quietly turned on the record player and let the music wash over her. Tears welled up in her eyes. It was the first time anyone had done something so thoughtful for her. Immediately afterwards, she told her friends. Years later, those memories remained vivid. Yu had never planned to marry Suk, but the daughter of the president of WJ Retail marrying the son of his driver felt like a fairy tale. Despite her parents' decision, Yu still felt like an outsider, and Suk's affection seemed to be the only genuine part of her life. She remembered his words, how he had once promised to try as long as they were together. But now, those same words felt hollow, tearing at her heart. Her thoughts snapped back to the present. She was still standing in front of that speeding car. In a blink, Yu was airborne, her heel left behind on the ground. The echoes of Sok's betrayal, the man who swore to her sister Ura that she was the only one he loved, rang in her ears. Her world had been stolen from her, piece by piece. And just like that, Yu's hard life came to a tragic end. But then, something strange happened. A voice called to her, faint at first, but growing louder. Yu's eyes shot open. She was alive. Confused, she found herself back in her bed, with Ura standing over her, asking how she was feeling. "What?" Yu gasped. "Wasn't she dead?" Slowly, she sat up, disoriented. Ura smiled and reminded her that today was the dress fitting for her wedding. She must look her best. Ura's heart raced. Was this a dream? She hurried to the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to make sense of it. Grabbing her phone, she checked the date. July 19th. But that couldn't be right. Wasn't it supposed to be November 20th? She blinked, staring at the strange marking on her wrist. Panic set in. Could it be that she had somehow travelled back in time? Determined to make the most of this second chance, Yu went to her dress fitting, trying to play along. The seamstress tightened the wedding gown, and as Yu stood in front of the mirror, she sighed, holding back her emotions. The sales clerk asked if everything was all right, and Yu reassured her it was. But when she saw Sok, looking enchanted by how beautiful she looked, her smile faded. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a bouquet and swung it at him, hitting him squarely on the head. Shocked, Sok asked what was going on, but Yu only smiled bitterly. Grabbing a pen from Seok's pocket, Yu tore the wedding dress right down the front. The saleswoman was aghast. Yu declared that this was her marriage dissolution gift to Seok, then casually handed over her credit card to pay for the now ruined dress. As she left the shop, Yu knew that this was her turning point. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Later, Yu met with a friend in a small, cozy coffee shop. Her friend, puzzled by Yu's decision to meet dog Ayo, asked why she had called for this impromptu meeting. Yu casually mentioned that she had broken up with Sok, shocking her friend. As they talked, Yu explained that Sok had fallen for Yura, leaving her no choice but to move on. Her friend's astonishment was evident, but Yu only laughed. The conversation turned to dog Aoyu. The heir to a wealthy family but known for his reckless behavior and obsession with gaming. Yu's friend was skeptical, but Yu seemed unfazed. She had a plan now, a vision for her future that didn't involve Seok or anyone else who had betrayed her. The past was behind her, and this new life was hers to shape. At an upscale event 2 days later, Yu found herself in the company of Dog Ayo, the younger son of the Sogging group, a man with a powerful presence and a well-tailored suit. He seemed like the perfect candidate for marriage, but as Yu scanned him, she recognized the same self-centered traits she had seen in Sog. Yet this time, Yu was different, no longer the naive girl from her past life, but someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Finally, Yu sat across from the guy her sister was interested in. After a brief conversation, Dogok tapped the table with a card, drawing Yu's gaze. He casually told her they should meet at the hotel later. Yu was stunned by his audacity and laughed to herself. Though she'd heard rumours that Dogok was arrogant, she hadn't expected him to be worse than those whispers. Dogok continued, saying he had also heard rumours about her. He understood she wasn't one of the easy ones. He smirked, remarking that Yu was actually quite the entertaining conversationalist. Immediately, Uppal joined in, rosing from the sofa. Front showed up convinced Uppal's math skills and completed their task. Uppel grinned and said it was just a meeting. Uppel raised an eyebrow and questioned whether he always had to be so direct. Uppel grinned and said it wasn't so bad, after all. Yu stared at him. I figured this was a test the moment we met, she said coolly. I'm not a fan of guys who flash a room key as their first move. Dogok, taken aback, tried to recover. He muttered that trusting his future to the woman who made him use that key on their first meeting didn't seem like a terrible idea. He met Yu's judgmental gaze, but couldn't read her expression. Yu stood up. I'm sorry, but I don't think I fit into the future you're imagining, she said. James Dogok, unfazed, wished her luck. Yu sighed deeply, deciding it was time to head home. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She spun around to see Yura standing there, with Seok at her side. The sight of them together made Yu's stomach churn. The reality of her memories hit her all at once. She froze. Yu knew she had to act, to show her sister that she was stronger. Without thinking, she turned back to Dogok, staring him down. Only one round for this test, right? At that moment, Yura noticed her sister in the cafe, her eyes widening as she saw Yu sitting with Dogok. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Dogok was confused by Yu's cryptic statement. One round? What do you mean? He asked. Before Yura could approach, Yura leaned forward, grabbed Dogok by the collar, and kissed him. His eyes shot wide open in shock. Across the cafe, Yura and Sok stood frozen, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Yura's face twisted from one of joy to one of disbelief and anger. Dogok, still processing the situation, suddenly realized that he was enjoying it. He reached out, cupping Yu's face as he deepened the kiss. Yu's eyes fluttered open, surprised by his reaction, but she didn't pull away. Until she finally remembered why she had started this in the first place. She broke away abruptly, wiping her lips in embarrassment, avoiding his gaze. Dogok blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend why Yu had stopped. Just then, Yura marched over, her expression stiff. What are you doing here, Mr. Dogok So? She stammered. Sok greeted Dogok, clearly just as surprised. Yura forced a smile and said it was quite the coincidence to run into Yu and Dogok here. Yu, turning to face Yu, simply asked what she was doing there with Sok. Before Yura could answer, Yura turned back to Dogok and smiled. Dinner tonight? She asked, teasingly handing him the room card. Dogok smirked. I think that sounds like a good idea. Yura and Sok exchanged confused glances as they watched Yu and Dogok continue their strange flirtation. Dogok took the card from Yu, and they both smiled at each other, leaving Yura fuming. The scene shifted to the hotel room. Dogok explained that it wasn't a suite, just a business room. He sighed and said, a business room. The number of women that have ever made it this far before. The number of... Yu interrupted, apologizing for the earlier kiss. She told him he was free to report it to Yura if he wanted to. Dogok chuckled, wiping his lips. What are you talking about? He asked. It wouldn't be as fun if we played by the rules. He leaned back, asking why Yu really wanted to meet him. Yu paused, then answered, because of the wedding. Dogok looked puzzled. Is there any other reason for a blind date? Yura turned away. Yura seems to like you, she said quietly. She turned back. Dogok raised an eyebrow. Is that why you wanted to marry me? Bean met her own reflection in the window. At first I thought it was about you, but now I'm thinking about starting a company. She turned back to face him, her eyes hard. I know about your grandfather's condition for investing. The condition is marriage. Once you get married, he'll let you start a venture. Dogok stared at her, processing her words in silence. Yu, sensing his hesitation, asked, What do you think about that? Dogok smiled, surprised by how well she knew his circumstances. Interesting, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. You talk like you know the future. Yu's phone suddenly vibrated, breaking the tension. Dogok glanced at it. Yu checked the caller. Yura. She immediately rejected the call. Dogok frowned. Why didn't you answer? Before she could respond, another call came in. It was Sok this time. Yu rejected it again and shrugged. Doesn't matter. Yu set her phone down and asked Dogok, What are your plans for tonight? She glanced up. If you're free, we could spend the evening together. Then she felt his weight on her shoulder. Dogok's eyes widened, caught off guard. Wait, you saying we should sleep together? How? He burst out laughing, unable to contain himself. Jude stood there, puzzled, realizing too late the double meaning of her words. Flustered, she covered her face with her hand. Dogok, still chuckling, leaned forward, asking, What exactly are you after, are you? A fake marriage, perhaps? I don't think I ask for much. He stared at her curiously. And what do I get out of this deal? The girl didn't know how to respond, and Dogok kept pressing her, asking what if he chose Yi over her. What was the difference? He asked her to prove that she was worth it, or maybe she could charm him enough for him to fall in love with her. U silently stared into his eyes, trying to think of something to say. However, she found herself amused by how similar Dogok was to her. It was entertaining. After a pause, U silently stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, deciding that wine might help them figure things out. She opened a bottle, poured a glass, and handed it to Dogok, remarking that if she were him, she would have bought a Nova Games instead of investing in hotel keys. Dogok was surprised by her comment, as he hadn't realized her interest in his business. He asked if she heard that from his manager, to which Yu responded by asking if he was the type of person who immediately ran to a supervisor when special issues came up. Dogok smiled, intrigued by her thoughts. Yu shouted. They continued drinking, and after a while the bottle was empty. U, tired, fell asleep in bed. Later she stirred, turning over and opening her eyes, only to be startled to find Dogok sleeping beside her. Even in his sleep he looked handsome. But then she noticed something. Her lipstick mark on his neck. Shocked and horrified, she started piecing together the events of the night. She had found Dogok's lip mark. She remembered them drinking together, her removing her coat and then throwing herself at him, saying she wanted to sleep. The memory made her blush. Deciding she needed to leave before Dogok woke up, she tiptoed around the room. But when Dogok shifted in his sleep, she jumped in fright, thinking he was awake. However, he remained asleep, much to her relief. Smiling at how handsome he looked even now, she left some money on the table to cover the cleaning costs and slipped out. As Yu drove away, her expression showed no sign of joy. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, her grandfather's hospital room. Upon entering, she saw him hooked up to an IV. He was surprised to see her and immediately took her hand, apologizing for everything. He told her she was his only granddaughter, repeating the apology over and over, with tears in his eyes. Yu felt a deep guilt. 3 months earlier, her grandfather had passed his entire inheritance to Ura, and Ura knew she needed to verify his words. She glanced around the room and saw his toothbrush, deciding to take it with her. As she reached for it, the door opened and Ura entered, addressing their grandfather. Ura smiled warmly at him, calling herself his granddaughter, and then started tending to him. Ura turned to Yu, remarking that she lacked respect for her elders and scolded her for not answering the phone yesterday. Yu sighed but pulled herself together, smiling confidently. She told her mother she was on a date last night. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she asked if the date was with Dogok from the sogging group. Yu laughed and confirmed it, though she wondered how her mother knew. Ura had mentioned it earlier. Yu smiled slyly, saying there would be good news soon. Meanwhile, at Dogok's office, a meeting was underway about the sales of the new game Golden Eye, which had increased by 22% in the first quarter. Despite the discussion, Dogok's mind wasn't on sales. He was still thinking about Yu. Her actions from the night before had puzzled him, especially the money she left behind with a note to cover cleaning and breakfast. As he reflected on her strange behavior, Dogok couldn't help but remember Yu's tipsy state the previous night. She had been talking, and whenever he turned away, she would yell at him, asking if he was paying attention. Rather than being annoyed, Dogok found it funny. Yu had summed up her life in a monologue, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Dogok if he could see memories. Dogok, staring at the floor, said he could. Yu had averted her gaze, confessing that there wasn't a single moment in her life that had truly hooked her. She asked Dogok how that could be, but he didn't have an answer for her. Frustrated, Yu had sighed and declared that this time it had to be different. Then, to Dogok's surprise, Yu suddenly got up, announcing she was going to bed. Dogok considered. Dogok was caught off guard by the abrupt change in conversation, especially when Yu started undressing. He tensed up, asking what she was doing. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to stop her from undressing, but she protested, screaming at him not to touch her. Dogok was trying to calm her down when he realized she still had a dress on under her coat. Relieved, he tried to compose himself, but Yu, in her drunken state, tripped over a chair and fell toward him. In a split second, Dogok couldn't catch her, and they both ended up on the bed. Yu, already half asleep, pressed herself against him. Dogok was left bewildered, his heart racing. He realized how much he liked her being close, but was also embarrassed by the situation. After a while, Yu rolled over to the other side, giving Dogok a chance to finally stand up. As he looked down at the sleeping girl, Dogok noticed something strange. A license plate on her hands caught his eye. He recognized the inscription. Looking at her, he whispered to himself that he didn't want to remember certain moments from his past either. Stroking her hair, Dogok promised himself that this time, things would be different. The scene shifted back to Dogok's office. It was already 10 a.m., and he hadn't received any calls from Yu, despite her mention of the wedding the day before. Just then, an employee interrupted Dogok's thoughts, asking if he was thinking about work or something else. The employee handed Dogok a tablet, congratulating him. On the screen was a news story titled, "Tycoon So Good," featuring a picture of Dogok and Yu. Immediately he started scanning the article, asking if it was about the second son of Sun Group. The guy responded that this wasn't the most important news at the moment. He warned the director that because of the criticism and scandal, the company could suffer losses. Suddenly, Dogok noticed the author of the article. It was his favorite cousin, Su Jan-non. After turning off the tablet and handing it back, Dogok asked if his assistant had contacted the girl. The assistant confirmed that he had and leaned in to share something even more interesting. He had found out that Dogok and the girl had gone to the same elementary school. Dogok asked if this meant they had a close relationship. The assistant clarified that they didn't, as they hadn't gotten along during that time. Dogok sighed, recognizing this as typical of Su Janan, and immediately asked his assistant to bring the reporter to him. The assistant hesitated and nervously asked if Dogok was planning to sleep with another girl. These words amused Dogok, and a smile spread across his serious face. A moment later, he burst out laughing, leaving the assistant bewildered. Suddenly, Dogok stood up, grabbed his jacket and started walking out. The secretary, confused, asked where he was going. Dogok turned, smiling, and said he was running away. Just as he reached the door, his assistant's eyes widened in fear, realizing it was too late. Someone was already there. The woman stood behind Dogok and asked where he was going. Turning in horror, Dogok greeted her sweetly, asking if she had arrived already. The woman, growing suspicious, asked if Dogok was planning to get married. He nervously confirmed, avoiding eye contact. The woman, frustrated, reminded him that he always avoided looking her in the eye when she asked that. Dogok sighed and admitted that even his father didn't know about it. This revelation shocked the woman, who demanded to know more. Dogok turned to his secretary and asked him to explain his nickname. Surprised, the secretary quietly explained that Dogok was asexual, had no sex drive, and was impotent. The woman was taken aback, utterly shocked by what she was hearing. Dogok smiled, explaining that he had lived with this condition his whole life and had to prove it to people. The woman, still in disbelief, asked if this was why Dogok wanted to get married. Dogok, seemingly unbothered, asked her why she had married his father, even though he already had a wife. In a fit of frustration, the woman slapped him, calling him a rude child. Dogok, stunned, watched as the woman angrily walked towards the elevator. Before she could leave, Dogok grabbed her arm and turned her around. He confidently told her that he would reclaim his father's company and win back both his father's love and his grandfather's legacy. The woman, unsure whether to believe him, asked what he meant. Dogok smiled sweetly, assuring her that he would make it happen. The scene shifted to a beautiful beach. Yu was on the phone, being asked where she had disappeared to. She calmly replied that she was at the beach, which shocked the person on the other end, who exclaimed that she must be crazy. Yu then confirmed that she was going to marry Dogok Aio. The friend on the phone, laughing, asked why she should help her. Yu sighed, hinting that she knew about her friend's secret relationship, which made the friend spit out her coffee in shock. The friend, panicking, asked how Yu knew. Yu reassured her that she wasn't following her, but added that the guy she was seeing had a pregnant girlfriend. The friend, horrified, asked if this was true, but Yu tried to downplay the situation. As the conversation continued, Yu suddenly spotted someone and abruptly ended the call. "If you think I'm lying, try and act out the conversation." Dogok stood in front of her, having finally found the girl who had been on his mind. He asked why she had stayed by the sea, admitting that he hated the beach. Avoided the question, asking why he had been looking for her. Dogok explained that she hadn't answered his calls, and that he wanted to return the money she had left. Yu, confused, told him there was no need to return anything. Dogok sighed, explaining that it was unusual for someone to leave a note and run away. Yu, taken aback by his confidence, jokingly asked if he had run out of money. Dogok smiled and admitted that he had suffered a loss, a significant one. He then reminded her that she had mentioned the wedding first, and he intended to take full responsibility. Although Yu was speechless, Dogok smiled and declared that there would indeed be a wedding. He thanked her for the incident and emphasized that her time was running out. If she didn't act soon, her sister would be the one standing next to him. Yu tensed, not wanting that outcome, and told him she understood. Dogok then invited her to have a meal with him, repeating the request when she hesitated. Yu, still uneasy, tried to refuse, claiming that she had her reasons for not eating with others. Dogok laughed, saying not to worry and that he would go first. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 bills, asking her to apologize properly for the kisses, the leaked photos, and the note. Tearing up the bills, he insisted that they should eat together, calling it the first condition of their wedding. The scene then shifted to a cafe where Yu looked around, unimpressed. She asked Dogok why food was the first condition for the wedding. He explained that if he hadn't insisted, they wouldn't be sitting together like this. Yu, frustrated, stared at the table. Dogok teased her, asking if the convenience store food was good enough for someone so squeamish. Yu, still irritated, admitted that at least the convenience store food didn't require her to check the cooking process. Dog noticed that Yu was upset about something and asked her what was wrong. She replied that she would be more downcast when rumors spread that the tycoon's son was now with an adopted girl. Dog tilted his head and found it interesting. Yu looked at him questioningly. Dog asked if he really looked like the biggest villain in the tycoon family, suggesting that maybe the girl was just crazy. Changing the topic, Yu asked if she had done something unnecessary that day. Dirk looked unsure and asked what she was talking about. Yu, flustered, clarified she meant the day at the hotel when they had drinks together. Dirk laughed, surprised that Yu probably didn't remember anything. He teased her, saying they were quite close that day. For example, Yu hugged him, left a kiss mark, and they even slept together. Shocked by his words, Yu hit the table and told him to stop. Duke switched the subject, asking why she was eating so little and whether she had already eaten today. Annoyed, Yu told him not to change the subject and added that it was her food, so she knew better. Duke acknowledged her point, but asked out of curiosity what kind of guys she liked. Yu, puzzled, said she had no preference and asked why he was suddenly asking. Duek asked how he measured up as a boyfriend. Yu's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked him to clarify. Duek said he was starting to like her a little, which is why he was curious about her thoughts. Receiving no answer, he asked again if she didn't have any thoughts about him. Yu stared at him, bewildered. Duek continued, saying they were going to get married, and people usually marry someone they like. Wasn't that right? Yu replied that such things were a waste of time and bad for business, but it wasn't the only response he left to the article either. Dirk smiled sarcastically, expressing regret. He was even feeling a little nervous. He started tapping the table and began to mention that night again, but I cut him off sharply, telling him to stop talking nonsense. Dirk smiled, noting that he hadn't even said anything yet. Ben smiled too, noting that I hadn't even faltered. How was it that she managed to slip up too? Yu noticed that Doek was staring at something on her hands. Looking down, she realized it was the strange inscription that appeared after death. Quickly, she covered it with her sweater sleeve, not wanting him to see it. She asked if he had noticed anything on her wrist. Doek, puzzled, asked if she was hiding something. Yu averted her gaze and said it was nothing. Doek, deciding to change the subject, asked if they could talk about something more important. Yu, serious now, said WJ Retail was about to fail financially, which was why Duik needed a marriage with Yura. Duik confirmed that he had insisted on the marriage as it would help him attract more investors. He explained that marriage was one of the conditions under which his grandfather would invest in the company and, if things went well, he could eventually control the company's shares. Yu smiled and revealed that she had already bought 5% of the shares and that they would sell out quickly as soon as WJ Retail's stock dropped. Dek was impressed by her foresight, but noted that it might take 30 years to achieve that goal. Yu smiled again and said that's why she needed him, so he would invest in her company. Puzenia nochot kasmia vidlacha convenjus kovortsalenda games. Tucha considered whether WJ Retail was worth the investment. Yu promised that he wouldn't regret it. Tucha considered whether she wouldn't regret it. Tushon talme Yu uninterested in their games, refused. Yu, uninterested in their games, refused. Tucha continued that what they were doing wasn't much different from playing a game, where there was a 50/50 chance of getting caught. Yu, undeterred, confidently replied that they would succeed no matter what. Suddenly, Yu received a message saying the results of a requested DNA test would be known in 2 weeks. Yu was thrilled, but tried to hide her excitement. Deok noticed her happiness and quietly said he was happy for her. Yu looked at him questioningly. He smiled, saying he liked her plan and encouraged her to keep trying. Deok stood up and Yu realized her plan had failed. He mockingly told her that if she wanted to marry him so badly, she should propose. Yu shouted in disbelief, asking what he was talking about. Deok continued, saying that in that case they'd need wedding rings. No kissing, though. Yu, shocked, started laughing nervously, saying that since it was necessary for the marriage, she would do everything required. Nook didn't expect that response. Yu held out her hand and declared that it was a proposal. Later, Yu drove home, deep in thought about the mystery surrounding her grandfather's death and the transfer of the inheritance to Ura. She feared the suicide note was forged and resolved to uncover the truth. As soon as she entered the house, her stepmother slapped her hard, shouting at her for not answering the phone and worrying everyone. Rubbing her cheek, Yu realized she had been wrong to think this woman was her biological mother. Her stepmother, arms crossed, said that legally she was still Yu's mother, unless Yu had found someone else. Yu retorted, asking if it was okay for Yura to have an unlawful relationship with a man. Her stepmother was furious, unable to believe what she had just heard. Yu sharply grabbed her mother's hand, saying she knew exactly who she was. The stepmother who had raised her since she was 9, and Yu added that she would marry Ju. Their conversation was interrupted by Yu's father, who came in and demanded that they stop arguing. He scolded Yu for how she was speaking to her mother. Yu, feeling betrayed, argued that she was his daughter too, but her father sternly told her she wasn't like Yura and expressed disappointment in her. Yu was devastated. Then, her stepmother, trying to calm things, apologized to her husband, taking the blame. The father left, telling Yu she'd be staying home for a while. Yu stood there, eyes downcast, feeling utterly defeated. The man, just as he was leaving, turned around and mentioned that she would be home for a while. Yu stood still, her eyes downcast, staring at the floor. The woman sighed softly and called for the 2 maids. As they approached Yu, one of them tried to remove the bag from her shoulder. Yu screamed, insisting she could do it herself. She then pulled her phone out of the bag, holding it out while warning the maid not to touch it. After this, Yu retreated to her room, and her stepmother smiled awkwardly at her outburst. Once inside her room, Yu shut the door behind her. The situation felt surreal. She hadn't thought she'd ever return to this place, yet here she was, driven by a new sense of purpose. She opened her drawer and began rummaging through her clothes, scattering them across the floor. Tying the shirts together, she approached the window, eyeing the height. It wasn't high, but it wasn't low either. Carefully, Yu began to lower her makeshift rope. At first, everything went smoothly, but then her foot slipped, and she plummeted toward the ground before she could grab hold of the rope again. Her eyes filled with fear, and for a brief moment, memories from her past flashed through her mind. The terrifying moment when she was hit by a car. She shut her eyes tightly, wondering if this was death coming for her again. Suddenly, a hand reached out, catching her before she hit the ground. It was the guard, who had luckily been nearby. Gently, he placed her on the ground, then looked at her intently and asked if she had been trying to escape. He added that if she truly sought revenge, she should stay in the house to achieve it. Yu looked at him, confused. Revenge wasn't on her mind. What did he know? The man adjusted his glasses, suggesting her actions weren't befitting of someone like her. Frustrated, Yu told him not to pretend he knew her or her motives. The man smiled and offered his hand. Yu's head was pounding, and she struggled to stand. She asked for her phone, and the man handed it to her, after asking what she planned to do. With a calm but determined tone, Yu replied, "To take revenge." He smiled knowingly and reminded her that he had, after all, advised her to stay. At that moment, the man pressed the intercom button, and a voice asked who was there. Dog Ao greeted them, holding a stunning bouquet of roses. When Yu's stepmother opened the door, she was stunned. What he had said was indeed coming true. Dog Ao smiled warmly and asked if he could come inside. The whole family, except Yu, gathered around the table. Dog Ao apologized for arriving unannounced, but the father waved it off, assuring him that the article wasn't worth worrying about. Dog Ao smiled awkwardly, apologizing again, but the father confirmed he'd seen the article and noted that such things were published nowadays without real evidence. Dog Ao nodded, adding that sometimes it's necessary to get rid of something, even if it's the truth. The stepmother couldn't hold back any longer and asked if the article was indeed true. Dog Ao glanced around and asked where Yu was. The stepmother forced a smile and replied that Yu had left early that morning, but Dog Ao, sipping his coffee, wasn't convinced. The father reassured him that he had already spoken to Yu and everything was fine, but Dog Ao said the opposite, that he was the reason Yu had become involved. The room turned tense. The father asked what Dog Ao meant, and after a moment, Dog Ao confessed that the article was true. Meanwhile, the guard quietly stood outside Yu's room, working discreetly to pick the lock. After a successful click, he opened the door and told Yu it was time. She agreed, saying it was time to show her family who she truly was. She walked silently down the hallway, past the guard. The family was still talking with Dog Ao, but the stepmother spotted Yu out of the corner of her eye and became furious. How had she escaped the locked room? Yu looked radiant, her hair gleaming in the sunlight and her simple dress highlighting her figure. The conversation halted abruptly as everyone noticed her, except Dog Ao, who smiled and commented that Yu must have been there all along. The stepmother seethed, while the father only frowned. She left. Yu pulled out a chair and sat beside Dog Ao. They exchanged smiles, glad to be in each other's presence. Dog Ao then boldly announced that he wanted to marry Yu. The room fell silent. The stepmother and daughter were completely stunned by his declaration. When pressed, Dog Ao explained that he had no other choice but to marry for love, not for political gain. He glanced at Yu, reaffirming his intentions, and Yu's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. The stepmother, visibly shaken, objected, pointing out that Yu had recently been through a breakup and couldn't possibly be ready for a relationship. Yu's father agreed, suggesting it might be best for her to move on from recent events before rushing into anything new. Yu, now tense, lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. Dog Ao took Yu's hand, promising to help her figure out what she truly wanted. He then stood, ready to leave, telling Yu they had reservations at a restaurant. Moments later, they were in his car, speeding down the road. Yu, still processing everything, asked him directly what his price was. Dog AIO laughed, reminding her that they had already discussed this. At the restaurant, Yu felt uncomfortable, not used to being treated so delicately in such a public setting. She distracted herself by scrolling through her phone, but when she opened a message from Sujan, she realized there had been no response. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dog AIO asked if she was going to eat. U assured him she was fine, but was clearly struggling to relax. When dessert arrived, U's discomfort only grew, her mind still elsewhere. After seeing the dessert, U's expression changed, and Dogok, noticing her reaction, looked a bit perplexed and asked if something was wrong. U began trembling uncontrollably, her mind drifting into a memory. In her recollection, a woman offered her the same dessert, smiling sweetly and urging her to open her mouth. Yu, surprised but trusting, told her mother that it tasted. She didn't get to finish her sentence. Her face twisted into horror and pain, and she collapsed to the ground, desperately calling for her mother, her hands clutching her throat as she coughed violently. Something was burning her throat. Frantically, she asked why the dessert tasted so strange. The woman, hovering over her, coldly asked why Yi called her mum, when she should only be addressed as auntie or ma. Snapped back to the present, staring in horror at the dessert in front of her, the memory of it being poisoned flooding her mind. That same woman had disliked her so much that she'd poisoned her. Dogok, still confused, asked again what she was thinking about. A little shaken, replied that everything was fine, and turned her head to look out at the evening cityscape. Sensing the tension, Dogok commented that if she didn't want the dessert, he'd gladly eat it. Yu turned back to watch him, her eyes wide with anxiety. As soon as he took a bite, Yu's heart raced, her eyes fixated on him, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Dogok smiled, swallowing his bite, and said if she was remembering something painful, she could share it with him. Yu was surprised by his words but touched. Few people ever showed concern for her like this. It was something entirely new for her. After a brief pause, Dogok looked around and smiled, saying this seemed like the perfect place to propose. He then asked if she had prepared the wedding rings and a kiss. Yu, taken aback, thought he was joking, but to her surprise, Dogok got up from his chair and knelt in front of her, wide, dark eyes fixed on Ben's plate. The colour was darkening around his cheeks as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "What are you doing?" she asked nervously. Dogok smiled, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the dim restaurant lights. "I'm making a real proposal," he said, his voice calm yet serious. Dogok then asked, "Will you marry me?" Before she could fully process what was happening. The ring was already on her finger. Suddenly, Yu asked if Dogok knew she was a zobik, someone who avoided kissing for hygiene reasons and had a strong aversion to uncleanliness. Dogok, taken aback, laughed and asked, "What about the evening we had?" Yu, feeling a little flustered, brushed it off, saying it was just business. Dogok smirked, leaning in and teasingly said, "Well, since it was just business, then..." Before he could finish, Yu grabbed him by the shirt, interrupting him, and declared that since she hadn't proposed, she had prepared a kiss instead. She pulled Dogok close and kissed him gently, standing on her toes to reach him. Dogok's bewildered expression softened as he began to enjoy the moment. Their lips, once inseparable, finally parted. Embarrassed, U stepped back, saying, "That's enough for now." But Dogok, not ready to let the moment end, pulled her back by the waist and kissed her again. The scene shifted to Dogok's office on a bright sunny day. Dogok was scrolling through the social news feed when suddenly he saw a photo of himself and Yu kissing. Did he really get caught again? Just then his secretary walked in and teased that the director had become a celebrity. Dogok jumped, startled by the news. The secretary went on, saying it was now official. The director was a public figure. Dogok sighed, understanding the situation. After a moment, the secretary asked if Dogok wanted him to handle the article, maybe even asking Sujan, the reporter, to delete it. Or should he, jokingly, cut off Sujan's middle finger as a warning? Dogok tensed at the second suggestion, saying the first option would do just fine. At that moment, a notification popped up on Dogok's phone. It was a message from Yu asking him to have lunch together. The request left Dogok speechless. Yu? Inviting him to lunch? Without hesitation, Dogok responded that he'd be happy to join her. His heart raced as he turned to his secretary seeking advice. "If a girl invites you to lunch, doesn't that mean she's interested?" he asked. The secretary, pondering, cautiously replied, "Probably." Dogok, unsure, pressed further. The secretary finally relented, adding, "As your brother-in-law, I'd say don't get your hopes up too soon." Dogok, a bit taken aback, laughed nervously. Dogok was leaving his office, heading toward the exit where Yu was supposed to be waiting for him. As he walked, he told himself it would be best to avoid drawing too much attention. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out to him. Thinking it was Yu, he lifted his head with a smile, only to find Yuru standing in front of him, smiling brightly. She began walking towards him, and as she did, memories flooded back. In the past, a younger Yu stood off to the side, scuffing the ground with the toe of her sneaker, watching her sister Yuru from afar. Yuru had wanted to approach her, to reach out, but she had barely taken a single step when their mother pulled her back. The woman gestured toward the vast estate around them, telling Yuru that everything she saw now belonged to her. Then, pointing to the lonely Yu, she coldly remarked that Yu wasn't real, unlike Yuru, who was the real one. It wasn't the first time their mother had said something like this, and each time she would ask Yuru if she understood. As Yuru walked toward Dogok in the present, she thought about all the things her mother had said, how they were, in a way, true. She had everything, the real things. Now, here she was, standing right in front of Dogok, who was clearly surprised by her sudden appearance. She was deep in thought, feeling that Ura didn't deserve him. Breaking the silence, the girl greeted Dogu and reminded him that it was nearly lunchtime. AA suggested that if Dogu had no plans, they could have lunch together. Looking questioningly at Ura, Dogu asked if she meant him. The girl smiled, confirming she had come to meet him and have lunch. Realizing there was a reason behind her visit, Dogu playfully asked if she wanted to eat or get married at the same time. The unexpected question left the girl momentarily stunned. But just a moment later, like her mother, Ura composed herself, smiling, and replied that they could eat first and then get married. As she sank into her memories, the girl recalled how everything in that house had been hers since the day she arrived. Everything in the WJ retail family belonged to her. She was always showered with gifts during the holidays and had never felt inferior to anyone. Her wealthy, tycoon father ensured she received all the love she needed, along with the ideal, socially imposed image of a family. But for Ura, it was all about furthering her legacy, and she wasn't going to let anyone else have it, especially not her obsessive, perpetually disgruntled sister, Dog. Upple remembered the day they first met. She'd been angrily scrolling through social media when she heard a pleasant male voice. She turned to see a tall, handsome brunette who immediately apologized for being late. Unlike anyone she'd met before, he was captivating. Looking into his eyes for the first time, Aura realized he had everything she wanted. They spoke for hours, discussing various topics. Aura mentioned how she believed marriage should be between people of the same status who got along well. Dog accepted her offer of coffee, but when he set his mug down, he told her bluntly that he wasn't thinking about marriage. Shocked, the girl jumped up and questioned him. Standing from the table, Dog said he had no choice but to attend this meeting because his mother had requested it. As she tried to change his mind, Dogok cut her off, saying he didn't want a political marriage. Even though his words hurt, Ura still found him irresistible. She decided then and there that Dogo Ayo would be her husband, no matter what. But as she thought back to that day, Ura struggled to understand why Yu and Dorguk were together. Why had they kissed that day? Why had he gone to her family's house and asked for permission to marry Yu on the same day? Seeing them hold hands, Ura couldn't keep her composure. She was filled with confusion and frustration, wondering why he chose Yu over her. Clenching her trembling fists, Ura knew taking him away wouldn't be easy. Returning to reality, she told Dogok they should eat first and then discuss marriage. But Dogok, clearly irritated, scratched his neck and said he wasn't interested in doing either. Smiling and looking into his eyes, Ura insisted she wanted a wedding. He averted his gaze, confused by her persistence. Turning back to her, he explained awkwardly that he already had a girlfriend. Surprised, Ura asked if he was truly going to marry her sister. Laughing, Dog folded his arms and pointed out that Ura was now trying to stop him. Suddenly, Ura began shouting across the floor that Yu had someone else, claiming her sister was only using Dogu for revenge. Taken aback, Dogu asked if Ura really believed that, if he didn't marry U, she should be the next option. The girl hadn't expected such a response, and looked at him with horror as the crowd in the building stared. Dogok, with a slight smirk, told Ura that he admired her boldness. He glanced at his watch, apologized, and added that he didn't have time to listen to Ura's tales. Without hesitation, he moved toward the exit, saying he had to leave. Ura quickly turned, trying to stop him, but Sudok interrupted, stating that he already had someone he was meeting for lunch. Curious, she asked who it was. He paused and, with a smile, asked if she truly didn't know. Then, turning back to her, he said he was going to have lunch with someone who often had trouble eating. The scene shifts back a few hours to the WJ retail estate, where Yu had just woken up, startled by an early phone call. Sleepily, she reached for her phone, struggling to identify the caller. Her eyes suddenly widened in shock. A picture of her kissing Dogu had been sent to her, with a message asking if it was a good photo. The sender casually mentioned that her brother was preparing a ring, and they had helped him a little. Yu immediately jumped up, trying to piece together the events of the previous night, recalling how Dogok had proposed and kissed her. Covering her mouth, she realized that he had orchestrated the whole thing in advance. The action then moved to Dogok's building, where Sadu was heading to a meeting, her thoughts consumed by the morning's events. She tried to reassure herself that this was just business and that there must have been a reason for his proposal. It didn't matter who started it. Business was business. As she lost herself in these thoughts, someone called out her name. She looked up to see Seo, her ex-husband, surprised to see her. Yu wasn't thrilled by this encounter and didn't want to engage, so she lowered her head and walked past him. Zor quickly grabbed her arm, asking if she had come to meet Direct Sol and whether they were truly getting married. Annoyed, U pulled her hand away and confirmed it. Sol, frustrated, began shouting, demanding to know what had happened to her. U laughed bitterly, telling him it didn't matter. She already knew Sol had been in love with Ura. Sol was shocked by her words, unable to comprehend how she knew. But Yu expected this reaction and, with little hope in her expression, told him to go talk to Ura. She didn't want him anywhere near her. As she walked away, Seo, still in shock, remarked that Yu had changed. Yu turned and replied that she hadn't changed at all. Seo, however, who had felt nothing from the beginning and was only now trying to fix things, was the one who had changed. Seo was dumbfounded and had no idea how Yu knew all this. He recalled the moment after Yu had left him, telling him that their marriage was over. His grandfather couldn't believe it, questioning Seo repeatedly. A frustrated Seo tried to explain but couldn't finish before his grandfather's hand shot out and struck him across the face, hard. "You're nothing," the old man spat, angry that Seo couldn't hold on to Yu. He asked if dissolving the marriage was all Seo could do. The family was horrified, especially Seo's mother, who tearfully asked what they would do now with the deposit for the store already paid. She pounced on him, demanding answers. Just then, Seo's sister burst in, asking what would happen to her fancy bag and GG dress. The family's overwhelming expectations fell heavily on Seo's shoulders, with everyone urging him to win Yu back at any cost. Seo, staring down at the floor, tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong and when it had all fallen apart. The scene shifts again, and now Seo is outside, talking with Ura. She casually mentioned that Seo was like family to her, and he smiled, feeling encouraged. Ura held his hand and spoke of how great it would be if they became one family. Confused, Seo agreed, only for Ura to suggest that they could become a family if he married her sister. Seo, bewildered, asked what her sister had to do with it. Ura held his hand tighter and, surprised, asked, "Don't you want to marry Ura?" Seo was taken aback. This girl, who had been sweet-talking him and hanging out with him, was now suggesting he marry her sister. Nevertheless, after a moment of contemplation, Seo turned away and gravely agreed to marry Ura. Overjoyed, began praising him, calling him the best. Seo, meanwhile, realized he had no choice but to move closer to Ura's family. His thoughts drifted back to that night of confession, the night he had spent with Ura. Looking out the window, she talked about how she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. She mentioned how sharing a room or a bed with anyone made her uncomfortable. Her boyfriend smiled and reassured her that he was fine with it. He still wanted to be with her. As he stared at the floor, he realized that things had turned out just as Yu had said. Maybe it was for the best, though there was one thing that continued to stress him out. One afternoon, Ura urgently called Seo, asking him to come over as soon as possible. When she got into the car, Seo immediately asked her what had happened and why she needed him so suddenly. Without much thought, Ura started shouting that Yu was going to marry Dog Ao. Grabbing Seo by his jacket, she begged him for help, saying that he was on her side. She tearfully confessed that she knew Yu still cared about her, and even more, she believed Yu liked her too. Ura desperately asked Seo to bring Yu back. Disheartened, Seo looked down and asked if Ura would marry Dogok if Yu didn't return. Ura sighed heavily, tears welling up in her eyes, and said that she would have to, because it was all for the family business. Anne, from what Seo did when she arrived, asked why she was pretending that Dogok didn't like her. He started shouting, telling her that she needed Dogok and he could see it clearly. Sighing heavily again, Seo realized he had no other choice. Reluctantly, he agreed to help and said he would try to convince Yu to come back to her. Ura's expression instantly changed from desperation to joy, and she thanked him profusely. As Seo watched her happiness, he thought to himself that if this was the only way to make her happy, then so be it. The scene shifted to the hospital. It was a sunny, bright day, perfect for Yu to get her test results. She had just left the building, holding an envelope with the results inside. Unable to wait any longer, she stopped and opened it. As her eyes scanned the paper, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. It revealed that Anan, the man she came to see, was 99.9% confirmed to be her biological father. Yu dropped the envelope, struggling to process the news. How could this have happened? Suddenly, it hit her. The unpleasant woman, Zhang Hai, must have known all along. Even her wool-covered life had been a forgery, a complete fraud. Yu looked up at the sky and laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. It hurt to realize that she would only learn about her real father's identity after his death. Later, Yu found herself standing in front of her house. The journey home had been difficult, and she was emotionally drained. As she reached for her keys, someone called out to her from behind. It was her ex-husband Sio's unpleasant relatives. They forced smiles, pretending to care about her well-being. Yu looked at them with disdain and asked what they wanted. Sio's mother began speaking, hesitantly, bringing up the topic of the marriage dissolution. She stumbled over her words, but eventually said they had come because they were worried. Seo stood emotionless as the woman continued pestering her with questions, trying to understand if Yu and Seo had fought. When the woman suggested they should simply ignore the rumors, her daughter Sei chimed in, saying, "All couples fight before they get married." Yu, already irritated by their presence, was growing increasingly stressed. Suddenly, Sei approached her and took her hand, suggesting they all go out to eat together to lift her mood. Without a second thought, Yu yanked her hand away and made it clear that she had no intention of going anywhere with them. Feeling cornered, Sio's mother then mentioned something about a contract. She hesitated but eventually blurted out that she was considering returning it, and, in fact, had taken out a loan. She sighed and said that everything was falling apart at the worst possible time. Yu, without any emotion, firmly said no and advised the woman to get a job. Turning away, she declared the conversation over and said there was nothing more to discuss. Just as Yu started walking away, the woman suddenly grabbed her arm and pleaded, asking if Yu wanted her to apologize. She begged Yu to reconsider the marriage, insisting that, although she didn't know what had happened between them, not all hope was lost. Looking at her ex-husband's family, Yu calmly stated that they no longer had anything to do with her. With that, she turned towards the door and began unlocking it. As a final statement, she made it clear that she had no intention of marrying Suk. Suk's mother, seemingly resigned, nodded and said she understood, but she hoped their promise still stood. Yu turned around, bewildered, as the woman, now on her knees, continued to plead. She promised she would give everything back, if only Yu would reconsider. Yu, tired of the theatrics, asked directly how the woman planned to return the money. Suk's mother, embarrassed, looked away, unable to answer. Yu sighed, telling them that once again they shouldn't count on her. Turning around, she told them to talk to her son instead. Her disheveled woman lowered her head, and Sei, horrified, asked her mother what they should do next. Suddenly, Suk's mum snapped. Grinding her teeth, she lunged at Yu, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her forward. The woman unleashed a tirade, bitterly complaining that Yu didn't even remember her birthday. She ranted that Yu was an ill-mannered girl who didn't know basic etiquette. Yu tried to break free but couldn't. Then she noticed something. A security camera. Realizing they were now out of frame, Yu knew she had to move. Slowly she started backing up, inch by inch, until she was back in view. Sei, witnessing the scene, stepped between her mother and Yu, trying to stop the chaos. but Suk's mother was beyond reason. At the last moment, she swung her arm wildly. There was a tense silence as her hand connected with Yu's face. The woman stood there, satisfied, while Yu stared at her, unfazed. Rather than reacting with anger, Yu began to laugh. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Lifting her hair to reveal the forming bruise, Yu asked the woman and Sei if they realized what had just happened. Her expression shifted, becoming sharper and more confident, as she coldly stated that physical assault had just occurred. Sok's mum, still fuming, demanded to know what Yu was talking about. But before she could finish, Sei called out to her mother, pointing upwards. There, hanging above them, was a camera. Sei tried to step away, but then came over quickly. She smirked, while being unsteady. "We are in the frame," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "It means I'll have fun with this now." Sei tried to take them to the police. Panic set in as Sei frantically begged Yu to forget the incident. Sei tried pulling her mother towards the door, urging her to leave. Wu exhaled, relieved. This nightmare was finally over. Just as she reached the doorstep, a man appeared, blocking her way. He asked how she was doing. Wu, slightly taken aback, asked who had sent him. Was it Grandpa? The man silently nodded. Yu then asked how her grandfather was doing, and the bodyguard replied that he was doing much better. Wu hesitated before asking if he would be able to travel to Seoul. The bodyguard said he wasn't sure. As Yu walked past him, the man suddenly turned and asked if it was true that Yu was getting married. Yu, surprised by the question, hesitated, but then confirmed it. The man looked at her, expressionless, and remarked that he hoped the man she was marrying was a worthy replacement for Yusok. Yu was puzzled by his words, recalling the strange things he had said before, like the time he caught her when she was about to fall, or the moment he advised her to stay home if she truly wanted revenge. Then she remembered the day of her father's death. That moment in the car, when she saw a missed call from Juanon, wondering why he had called her in the first place. The scene shifted to a small but charming restaurant. Dogok entered and was greeted warmly by his family, who were already gathered there. His mother beamed, proudly mentioning that she never dreamed her son would finally find a good bride. Dogok smiled, but quickly changed the subject, saying there was something he wanted for himself. As Dogok's sister joined the conversation, the mood shifted. She teased him about going crazy over this girl he liked. Dogok interrupted, starting to tell his story, even though his family already knew quite a bit about the girl. His mother frowned and mentioned that she had heard Yu wasn't exactly a decent girl, asking if she was an orphan. Dogok, irritated, picked up his glass and thought to himself that Yu was far from someone to be talked about like that. Abruptly, his mother slammed her fist on the table, declaring that there would be no marriage with Yu. His father, unfazed, sipped his coffee and said that Dogok could do whatever he wanted. The argument escalated, with his mother yelling, but his father calmly reminded her that Dogok's choices were his own. Dogok watched his parents quarrel, thinking back to how he had always been on his own, making decisions by himself. Finally, Dogok stood up, wishing his family a pleasant meal, and prepared to leave. Just then, Donya, his sister, excitedly announced that their older brother was arriving. The door opened, and a joyful man entered, laughing and greeting everyone. Dogok, however, was less than thrilled at his brother's arrival. The scene shifted back to WJ Retail, where Yu sat on her cozy bed, reading. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening startled her, and she jumped. Yura stood before her, explaining that Seok had arrived and was waiting for her. Yu, frustrated, said she didn't want to see him. She reminded Yu that Seok had betrayed her and demanded to know what he wanted. Ura explained that Seok had come to talk, and you, without hesitation, told her to send him away. There was nothing to discuss. But Ura, defiant, said she would let him in anyway. Moments later, Sok peeked in through the door and smiled. Barely containing her anger, Yu asked why he couldn't respect her wishes. She sarcastically wondered if Ura had put him up to this. Sok, surprised, remained silent, confirming her suspicions. U sighed, her frustration evident. Sok approached her, pleading for another chance, apologizing for the past, and promising he would never hurt her again. Said frosty lips. But Yu, tired of his words, pulled her hand away and coldly told him to get out. Seok, devastated, fell to his knees, begging her not to marry Dogok, saying it would break his heart. Yu, baffled by his audacity, asked what he was even talking about. Seok, desperate, said he would pretend it never happened, and in that moment, proposed to her. Yu jumped at the turn of events and asked Sok why he was looking at the girl with such intense eyes. He responded that she understood everything and he still liked her. The girl, however, met Sok's gaze with disgust and distress, immediately recalling a day filled with overwhelming emotions. She remembered her sister and ex-husband, a couple once in love, and how he swore his love for her sister. As these memories surfaced, the girl began to smile madly and told Sok it was all a farce. It amused her to watch him pretend to care, but she wasn't willing to pretend anymore. With anger, she accused him of being at fault. Seok tried to reason with her, saying she wasn't like this before. Just then, something small hit him. He picked it up and asked what it was. U revealed that her family had visited her recently and handed him a flash drive, warning him that tampering with it would be unwise. It was just a copy. Looking at Seok's disappointment, she told him next time she wouldn't hesitate to go to the police. Defeated, Seok left the room in a fury. As Sok stormed out, Ura was walking down the corridor with a tray of water meant for Sok and Yu. She was puzzled by how quickly he left, but continued on to the room. Once inside, Ura sat across from Yu, confessing that her thoughts had been troubling her for days. She couldn't understand why Yu had supported her meeting with Dogok. Ura asked if her sister had led her down this path. Yu, bewildered, reflected on what Ura had said. It had all happened before her death and awakening. Ura mentioned how she noticed they were treated differently. Yu was constantly ignored, while she was praised. Yu smiled at the comment and said Ura didn't truly understand. Their mother had always said Yu was fake, not real, like Ura. As Ura processed this, Ura reminded her that she could do what she wanted now. Yu seemed to take pleasure in this idea, and without warning, splashed water onto her sister. Shocked, Ura demanded to know what Yu was doing, but Yu only laughed, reminding her that she had given permission to let go. Yu thanked her sister for the encouragement, and ominously added that this was just the beginning, worse things were coming. She even claimed that Dogok would be her husband. Horrified, Ura screamed that Yu couldn't be with him, but Yu coldly told her not to be jealous. Ura, desperate to understand, asked about Sok. They had been planning to marry. Yu calmly replied that she knew Sok loved her sister, which is why she ended things with him. Suddenly, Ura's anger surged, and she grabbed a glass of water, dumping it on U. Now both sisters were drenched, but while Ura was distraught, U only smiled, victorious. At that moment, a male voice interrupted them. It was Dogok. He looked perplexed, asking if the sisters were fighting. Embarrassed, they blushed as he entered the room, mentioning that he didn't realize he was such a frequent topic of conversation. Dogok handed Yu a napkin, wiping the water from her face, which made Yura seethe with jealousy. To her, Yura didn't deserve such care from Dogok, yet here he was, attending to her. He then asked the girl if she was okay. Yu looked carefully into his eyes, but then turned her head, noticing her stepmother in the doorway, furious. Seeing her stepmother's expression lifted Yu's mood. She told Dogok she wasn't feeling well, taking his hands in hers, and said that things weren't good at all. She pulled him closer, asking for a hug. Dogok, puzzled, hesitated for a moment before they found themselves sitting together in the car. Outside, heavy rain poured down. As they drove, Dogok commented that Yu was quite the actress. She sighed, admitting she had no choice. Silence filled the car as Yu stared out at the passing scenery. Suddenly, Dogok broke the silence by revealing that he had a similar situation with his older brother. Surprised, Yu turned to him, and Dogok explained that they had different mothers. In front of others, his brother pretended to be nice and perfect, but in reality, no one knew his true nature. Yu tried to recall his brother's name. Was it Jang Woko? Dogok confirmed that his brother wasn't perfect at all. With an angry look, he added that his brother was only genuine with him and no one else. Yu didn't know how to respond to Dogok's story, so she remained silent. They continued driving through the heavy rain, and Yu couldn't help but notice how serious and reliable Dogok seemed. She found herself thinking about how handsome he was. After a while, Yu coughed and asked where they were headed. Dogok laughed and told her it was a bit late to ask. Pointing to a building, he said that this was their new home, where they would live together. Yu screamed in bewilderment, asking if he had just picked her up and brought her here without telling her. Dogok calmly replied that if they didn't like it, they could leave. But Yu hesitated, not wanting to follow him. Ignoring her reluctance, Dogok told her to come along and stop freaking out unnecessarily. Soon they were standing in front of the door to their new apartment on the 5th floor. As they approached the door, Dogok asked if she remembered the day at the hotel. Confused, Yu asked him to clarify. Smiling, he said the password was the date they first met at the hotel. Exhausted, Yu asked if that date had any special meaning. Opening the door, Dogok confirmed it did. It was the night they spent together. She stopped at the threshold, her mind flashing back to that night. The night had been relatively normal, but she shuddered at the memory of the morning after and the lipstick mark on her neck. Snapping back to reality, she decided to forget it as soon as possible. As they entered the apartment, Yu couldn't help but notice how